Some say the deepest bonds are forged in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where a man and his dog share an understanding that needs no words. For 23 years, Ezra Colt had walked the high country trails with his faithful hound Blue, living simply and honestly in the shadow of mountains that had watched over his family for 3 generations. On this crisp autumn morning, they came upon something impossible. Standing in a forgotten valley was a castle, a real medieval fortress with stone towers and crumbling walls, sitting abandoned in the American wilderness, like it had been dropped there from another world entirely. Blue growled low, hackles raised, sensing something wrong about the place. Ezra felt it too, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What was this strange castle hiding in the heart of untamed country? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra Colt had never been a man to question the natural order of things. Born 62 years ago in a cabin that his great-grandfather had built with hand tools and determination, he understood the mountains the way other men understood city streets. Every ridge, every creek bed, every stand of timber from here to the Canadian border held memories of hunts, of long walks with his father, of lessons learned through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and the promise of snow. Winter would come early this year. He could feel it in his bones. Blue walked beside him with the easy gait of an animal born to rough country, his blue-black coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the aspen canopy. The dog was 10 years old now, getting on in years, but still sharp as the day Ezra had found him as a pup, half-starved and stubborn, refusing help, until Ezra simply sat down and waited for trust to grow between them. That was the way of things in the high country. Patience rewarded those who understood its rhythms. Ezra had learned this lesson well during his 40-year career as a mountain guide, leading city folks and weekend warriors through country that could kill the unprepared without malice or warning. He'd retired 5 years ago, not by choice but by circumstance, after Sarah passed and left him with a loneliness so profound it seemed to echo off the peaks themselves. Sarah had been his anchor to the world beyond these mountains. She'd kept the books for his guiding business, tended their small garden, and filled their cabin with the warmth of laughter and the smell of fresh bread. When the cancer took her, it took with it his desire to share these mountains with anyone else. Blue had been her dog too, and in the months after her death, the two of them had grown closer, united in their quiet grief and their understanding that some losses leave permanent shadows on a man's heart. The cabin where they lived sat in a natural clearing at 7,000 feet, surrounded by lodgepole pine and protected from the worst of the winter winds by a rocky outcrop that Ezra's grandfather had called Sentinel Ridge. It was a simple place, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch where Ezra spent most evenings watching the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Solar panels and a small wind generator provided enough electricity for basic needs, while a hand-pumped well and a wood-burning stove kept him connected to the old ways his family had always known. This morning had started like any other. Coffee black and strong, a breakfast of eggs from his small flock of chickens, and the ritual of checking his grandfather's brass compass, a family heirloom that had guided 3 generations of Colt men through these mountains. The compass had belonged to his great-grandfather, who'd used it during his days as a surveyor for the railroad, and it had never failed to point true north in all the decades since, until today. Ezra had noticed it first when they'd started down the trail toward Bear Creek, where he planned to check his traps before the season turned. The needle had wavered, spinning lazily in its housing like it couldn't quite find magnetic north. He'd tapped the glass, thinking maybe condensation or elevation had affected it. But the strange behavior had only grown more pronounced as they'd walked deeper into the valley. Now, standing at the edge of this impossible sight, the compass needle spun like a child's toy, pointing first toward the castle, then away. then spinning in complete circles as if the very concept of direction had lost all meaning. Blue pressed against his leg, a low whine deep in his throat. Not fear exactly, but something deeper and more primal. Recognition, perhaps, of forces that existed beyond the natural world they both understood so well. The castle rose before them like something from a fever dream. Its walls were built of grey stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and ivy covered much of its lower portions in tangled green curtains that stirred without any breeze to move them. 3 towers reached toward the sky, their peaks crowned with battlements that spoke of a time when men fought with swords and arrows rather than rifles and determination. The architecture was unmistakably European, Gothic perhaps, or Norman, with pointed arch windows and decorative stonework that belonged in the French countryside, not in the remote wilderness of Montana. What disturbed Ezra most was the castle's condition. For a structure that had no business existing in this place, it was remarkably well preserved. Oh, it showed its age. Crumbling mortar here and there, stones displaced by roots and weather, wooden shutters hanging askew on rusted hinges. But it stood solid and imposing, as if it had weathered centuries rather than the mere decades since anyone had last surveyed this particular valley. Ezra pulled a folded topographical map from his jacket pocket and spread it against a convenient boulder. He'd been studying these maps for 40 years, knew every contour line and elevation marker within 50 miles of his cabin. According to the survey markers and his own experience, they stood in what should have been a natural meadow beside Bear Creek, roughly 2 miles southeast of Widow's Peak. The map showed no structures, no ruins, no historical markers, nothing but wilderness that had remained unchanged since the last ice age carved these valleys from living stone. Yet here stood proof that maps, like compasses, could sometimes lie. The nearest town, Millbrook, lay 40 miles northeast, along a Forest Service road that was barely more than 2 ruts carved through the timber. Ezra made the trip perhaps twice a month for supplies and the occasional conversation, with folks who remembered when the high country had been home to loggers and miners rather than weekend adventurers and government bureaucrats. If anyone had stories about mysterious castles appearing in the wilderness, it would be the old-timers who gathered each morning at Murphy's Cafe to solve the world's problems over coffee and speculation. But Ezra had never heard so much as a whisper about anything like this. In a community where the discovery of a new cave or an unusual rock formation could fuel conversation for months, a medieval castle would have generated enough talk to reach even his isolated ears. The fact that it hadn't suggested either that no one else had ever found this place, or that those who had found it had chosen not to share their discovery. Blue's whining grew more insistent, and when Ezra looked down, he saw that the dog's hackles were fully raised, making his already impressive frame look even larger. Blue had the heart of a wolf and the loyalty of a saint, but Ezra had never seen him display this particular combination of wariness and agitation. The dog's pale blue eyes, the feature that had earned him his name, were fixed on the castle's main entrance, where massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Ezra checked his rifle, a lever-action Winchester that had belonged to his father and had put meat on the family table for 3 decades. The weight of it felt reassuring in his hands, though he suspected that whatever waited in that impossible castle would not be discouraged by mere bullets. Still, a man faced the unknown with the tools he understood, and Ezra understood the language of powder and lead better than most. The sun had reached its zenith while they'd stood studying the castle, and now shadows were beginning to stretch eastward from the towers and walls. Soon it would be evening, and evening in the high country meant temperatures dropping toward freezing and darkness that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. If Ezra was going to investigate this mystery, it would have to be now. While daylight remained to guide his steps, he knelt beside Blue and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the tension in the animal's muscles. "I know, old friend," he said quietly. "Something's not right about this place. But we've come this far, and I've got questions that need answers. Blue looked up at him with those pale, intelligent eyes, and Ezra could swear he saw understanding there and disappointment. The dog knew, with the instinct that had kept his wild ancestors alive for millennia, that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The first step across the castle's threshold felt like crossing into another world entirely. The moment Ezra's boot touched the worn stone of the entrance, the temperature dropped by what felt like 20 degrees, and the air took on a weight and stillness that pressed against his ears like deep water. Behind him, Blue whined once, a sound of pure distress, then fell silent. Ezra turned to reassure his companion, but the words died in his throat. Blue stood rigid at the entrance, every muscle tense, his pale eyes wide, with an emotion that looked disturbingly like terror. The dog took one tentative step forward, then jerked back as if he'd touched something hot. He tried again, pressing his nose toward the threshold, only to retreat with a sharp yelp. "Come on, boy," Ezra called softly, but even as he spoke, he could see it was useless. Whatever force or presence inhabited this place, it had drawn a line that Blue could not or would not cross. The realization sent a chill down Ezra's spine that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold. In 23 years together, there had never been a place where Blue wouldn't follow him. As Ezra knelt to examine the threshold stones more closely, searching for some explanation for his companion's distress, his fingers brushed against something metallic embedded in the ancient mortar. Working carefully with his pocket knife, he pried loose what appeared to be an iron key, its surface dark with age, but surprisingly free of rust. The moment his fingers closed around it, warmth spread up his arm. Not the natural warmth of sun-heated metal, but something deeper and more purposeful, as if the key had been waiting for his touch. The key was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its shaft was thick and heavy, wrought from iron that seemed to hold depths of darkness within its surface. The head bore intricate engravings that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally, forming patterns that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. Despite its obvious age, the key felt solid and substantial in his palm, radiating that strange warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Blue barked once, sharp and urgent, drawing Ezra's attention back to the world beyond the castle. The dog's message was clear. Come back, leave this place, return to the safety of familiar trails and natural order. But the key in Ezra's hand seemed to pulse with insistence, pulling his attention deeper into the castle's shadowed interior. The main hall stretched before him, vast and dimly lit by shafts of sunlight that filtered through narrow windows set high in the stone walls. Dust motes danced in those pale beams like tiny spirits, and the air carried scents that had no business existing in this place: beeswax and wood smoke, leather, and something that might have been fresh bread, as if the castle had been inhabited mere hours ago rather than sitting empty for decades or centuries. His footsteps echoed strangely in the space, each sound seeming to stretch and multiply until it became difficult to distinguish between the noise of his boots on stone and other sounds that might or might not have been footsteps following in his wake. When he stopped to listen, the echoes continued for a moment longer than they should have, creating the unsettling impression that someone else was walking through the hall, matching his pace and direction, but remaining always just out of sight. The walls were lined with tapestries that depicted scenes of hunting and warfare, their colors remarkably well preserved despite the apparent age of everything else in the castle. Knights on horseback pursued stags through stylized forests, while ladies in flowing gowns watched from castle windows that looked disturbingly similar to the ones through which sunlight now streamed. In one particularly detailed tapestry, Ezra noticed a figure that made him stop and stare, a man in rough clothing walking beside a dark-coated dog, approaching a castle that was unmistakably the one in which he now stood. The iron key grew warmer in his palm, and when he looked down at it, he could swear it was glowing with a faint inner light. The sensation was not entirely pleasant. The warmth had taken on an insistent quality that bordered on burning, though when he examined his palm, there was no mark or blister to show for it. From somewhere deeper in the castle came a sound that made him freeze in place. Voices, low and indistinct, carrying on air currents that seemed to flow against all natural logic. He could not make out words, but the cadence and rhythm were unmistakably conversational, as if people were discussing matters of daily concern in rooms that should have been empty for generations. Ezra's practical nature warred with the evidence of his senses. Every rational thought he'd ever had insisted that abandoned castles did not appear overnight in valleys where no castle had ever stood, that iron keys did not pulse with supernatural warmth, that voices did not echo through halls where no living person should be present. Yet here he stood, holding impossible proof in his palm, while the sound of invisible conversation drifted from the castle's depths. He called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Hello? Is someone there?" The response was immediate and unsettling. The voices stopped abruptly, as if whatever had been speaking had suddenly become aware of his presence and chosen silence over revelation. The quiet that followed felt heavy with attention, as if unseen eyes were studying him from every shadow and alcove. The key's warmth intensified, and Ezra found his feet carrying him deeper into the hall without any conscious decision to move. It was as if the key was guiding him, drawing him towards some specific destination within the castle's confusing layout. Behind him, he could hear Blue's occasional bark, plaintive calls that seemed to grow more distant with each step he took, though he had walked no more than 100 feet from the entrance. When he turned to look back, the entrance seemed much farther away than it should have been, reduced to a small rectangle of daylight that appeared impossibly remote. Worse yet, when he took a step back toward it, the distance seemed to remain constant, as if the hall was stretching to maintain separation between him and the outside world. The realization that he might be trapped sent a bolt of fear through him that was both sharp and familiar. He had felt this same terror once before, during his 3rd year as a mountain guide, when an early blizzard had caught him and a client on an exposed ridge with no shelter and night falling fast. That time, experience and determination had seen them through to safety. But this was different. This was a trap built from forces that existed outside his understanding of how the world worked. The iron key pulsed again, its warmth now urgent and demanding. When Ezra held it up to catch the light from one of the high windows, he could see that it was definitely glowing, though the light it cast seemed to illumine nothing beyond itself. The engravings on its head had become clearer, resolving into symbols that looked almost like letters from some ancient alphabet. Though he could not begin to guess at their meaning, from deeper in the castle came another sound, not voices this time, but something that might have been music, though played on instruments he couldn't identify. The melody was haunting and melancholy, speaking of loss and longing in a language that needed no words. It seemed to come from all directions at once, filling the hall with echoes that built upon themselves until the air itself seemed to vibrate with sorrow. Blue's barking had stopped. The realization hit Ezra like a physical blow. His faithful companion had gone silent, and that silence felt more ominous than any amount of distressed vocalization. He turned toward the entrance, cupping his hands around his mouth to call out, but no sound emerged from his throat. It was as if the castle had stolen his voice, along with his freedom of movement. The key burned in his palm now, hot enough that maintaining his grip required genuine effort. But something deeper than fear or pain compelled him to hold on. A growing certainty that this key was not just a random artifact, but something that had been waiting specifically for him to find it. The warmth it radiated felt almost like recognition, as if it knew him and had been prepared for this meeting across distances of time and space that defied comprehension. As the mysterious music swelled around him, Ezra made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour ago. Instead of fighting the key's insistent pull or struggling against the supernatural forces that had trapped him in this place, he chose to follow where the iron key led. Whatever secrets this castle held, whatever purpose had drawn him across its threshold, he would see them through to their conclusion. The alternative, remaining forever in this entrance hall, neither advancing nor retreating, while Blue waited outside for a master who could never return, was unthinkable. Better to face the unknown than to surrender without understanding what forces had brought him to this moment. With the iron key growing ever warmer in his palm and the haunting music growing stronger with each step, Ezra Colt walked deeper into the impossible castle, leaving behind the world he understood and entering a realm where the rules of nature held no sway. The iron key led Ezra through a maze of corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't paying attention. Passages that had stretched straight ahead would suddenly curve to the left or right, and doorways that had been closed when he passed them, the first time stood open on his return, revealing chambers that defied the castle's exterior dimensions. He found himself in what must have been the Great Hall, a vast chamber with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above and walls lined with tall windows that let in light from impossible angles. At the far end of the hall, above a fireplace large enough to roast an entire elk, hung a shield that drew his attention like a magnet draws iron. The Sentinel's shield, as he found himself thinking of it, was crafted from steel that had been polished to a mirror finish, though time had dulled its surface to a warm pewter glow. The coat of arms it bore was unlike any heraldry he'd ever seen, not a lion or eagle or any recognizable symbol, but something that seemed to shift and change as he watched, resolving into shapes that looked almost familiar before dissolving back into abstract patterns. As Ezra approached the shield, the iron key's warmth intensified, and he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The polished surface of the shield was reflecting not the great hall around him, but scenes from his own life. He saw himself as a young man, standing beside Sarah on their wedding day, her face radiant with joy and hope. The image was so vivid, so achingly real, that he reached out to touch the shield's surface. The moment his fingers made contact with the metal, the reflection changed. Now he saw Sarah in their cabin kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she kneaded bread dough, humming a tune he recognized but couldn't name. The scene had the warm, golden quality of memory, but it moved and lived as if he were watching through a window rather than recalling the past. "Sarah," he whispered, and his voice echoed strangely in the great hall, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The reflection shifted again, showing him Sarah in their garden, tending the tomatoes she'd been so proud of, her hair catching the morning sunlight. Then Sarah reading by the fireplace on a winter evening, her face peaceful in the lamplight. Then Sarah in the hospital bed during those final weeks, her hand in his, her eyes still bright with love despite the cancer's relentless advance. The pain that washed over him was so intense that he staggered backward, his hand falling away from the shield. But the reflections didn't stop. They continued to play across the polished surface, showing him moment after moment from their life together. 23 years of shared joy and sorrow, of small victories and quiet contentments, of a love so deep and true that losing it had left him hollow as a wind-carved stone. Outside, he could hear Blue howling, long mournful calls that spoke of loss and confusion. The sound carried clearly through the castle walls, as if the supernatural forces that trapped him here wanted him to know that his faithful companion was suffering. Each howl felt like a knife in his chest, reminding him that his decision to enter this place had consequences beyond his own fate. Ezra forced himself to step away from the shield, though every fiber of his being wanted to stay and lose himself in the visions of Sarah. The iron key pulsed in his palm, its warmth now accompanied by a subtle vibration that seemed to match his heartbeat. When he looked around the great hall, he noticed details that hadn't been visible before. The stones of the walls were not uniform grey as they had appeared from outside, but showed subtle variations in color and texture. Some radiated a warmth he could feel from several feet away, while others seemed to absorb heat and light, creating pockets of cold that made his breath mist in the air. The pattern was not random. The warm stones formed rough spirals and geometric shapes that suggested meaning, though he could not decipher their significance. The hall's floor was inlaid with a mosaic that depicted a vast tree, its roots spreading beneath his feet and its branches reaching toward the shadowed ceiling. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each leaf and twig rendered in colored stones no larger than his thumbnail. But as he studied the pattern, Ezra began to notice that some of the leaves were missing, leaving dark gaps in the design. The missing pieces corresponded to areas where his footsteps had fallen, as if his presence was somehow erasing parts of the ancient artwork. This realization troubled him more than the supernatural phenomena he had already witnessed. The idea that he was somehow damaging this place, inadvertently destroying something that had survived for centuries or longer, went against every principle his grandfather had taught him about respecting the places a man visited. Leave only footprints, take only memories. But here even his footprints seemed to cause harm. The mysterious music he had heard earlier began again, drifting from passages that led deeper into the castle. The melody was different this time, less mournful and more urgent, as if whatever force controlled this place was trying to communicate something important. The iron key responded to the music, its glow intensifying and its warmth becoming almost uncomfortable. Ezra checked his rifle and the ammunition in his jacket pockets, though he suspected that conventional weapons would be of little use against whatever he might encounter in this place. Still, the familiar weight of the Winchester provided some comfort, a connection to the practical world he understood. He also pulled out a piece of chalk he carried for marking trees and stones while hunting, and began making small marks on the walls as he moved through the hall. If this castle was going to shift and change around him, he would at least try to keep track of where he had been. The howling outside had taken on a different quality, no longer just mournful, but urgent, as if Blue was trying to warn him of some approaching danger. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions now, echoing off the castle walls in ways that made it difficult to determine where his companion was positioned. This concerned Ezra more than anything else he had experienced since crossing the threshold. Blue's sense of direction was flawless, and his loyalty absolute. If he was moving around the castle perimeter, it meant he was searching for another way in, or trying to position himself to help when his master emerged. If his master emerged, the thought struck him with sudden cold certainty. This castle was not just a mystery to be explored, it was a trap, carefully designed to capture those who entered. The iron key that had seemed like a tool for unlocking secrets might instead be a key for locking him permanently inside. The warm stones and shifting passages, the visions in the shield and the music that drew him deeper, all of it could be elaborate mechanisms designed to keep visitors from ever finding their way back to the world they had left behind. Yet even with this realization, Ezra found himself unable to turn back toward the entrance. The iron key's pull was too strong, and the promise of answers too compelling. Whatever force had created this place and set this trap, it had chosen its bait well. A man who had lost everything that mattered to him was vulnerable to visions of what he had loved most. And the shield's reflections of Sarah had awakened a hunger in his soul that simple survival instinct could not overcome. As evening light began to filter through the high windows at increasingly steep angles, casting the great hall into patterns of gold and shadow, Ezra made his choice. He would follow the iron key's guidance and face whatever lay deeper in the castle. But he would do so as himself, a mountain man who had survived 62 years in country that killed the careless and the weak. Whatever supernatural forces controlled this place, they would find him a more challenging opponent than they might expect. The iron key pulsed once more, and Ezra began walking toward the passage from which the mysterious music seemed to emanate. his chalk marks on the walls behind him, and Blue's increasingly distant howls, following him into the castle's shadowed depths. Night had fallen outside the castle walls, and with it came a transformation that Ezra could feel in his bones. The mysterious music that had been drawing him deeper into the labyrinthine passages grew stronger, more complex, as if a full orchestra had joined what had begun as a solitary melody. The iron key's glow had intensified to the point where it cast actual shadows, and the warmth it radiated had become so pronounced that he had to shift it from hand to hand to prevent burns, following a corridor that seemed to stretch much farther than the castle's exterior. Dimensions should have allowed. Ezra discovered a chamber that defied explanation. The room was circular, with walls carved from what appeared to be a single piece of dark stone. But it was not the architecture that stopped him in his tracks. It was the massive tablet that dominated the center of the space. The chronicle stone stood 8 feet tall and nearly as wide, its surface covered with text that seemed to shimmer and move in the light from his glowing key. As Ezra approached, words became visible, carved letters that filled themselves with silver light as he watched, writing themselves across the stone's face with deliberate, methodical precision. The language was English, though the style of lettering was archaic, reminiscent of old gravestone inscriptions or medieval manuscripts. What he read there made his blood run cold. William Hartwell, surveyor of the Northern Pacific Railway, entered these walls on the 15th day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1887. He carried with him instruments of brass and iron, seeking to map what could not be mapped. The castle welcomed him as it welcomes all who carry loss in their hearts. He searches still. Below that entry more names appeared as Ezra watched, each accompanied by dates and brief descriptions that read like epitaphs. Margaret O'Sullivan, widow of Butte, entered on Christmas Eve, 1891, seeking her husband's voice in the wind. She found what she sought and remains to hear it always. Thomas Blackwood, trapper and fur trader, entered on the 7th day of June, 1923, following his son's trail into these walls. Father and son are reunited in the endless hunt. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, veteran of the Great War, entered on Armistice Day, 1947, carrying the weight of fallen comrades. He found them waiting in the halls of memory. The list continued, dozens of names spanning more than a century, each representing someone who had discovered this impossible castle and chosen to enter its walls. As Ezra read, he began to understand a terrible pattern. Every person described had been marked by loss, by grief, by the kind of profound loneliness that came from having loved deeply and lost completely. At the bottom of the stone, new words were appearing in real time, silver letters flowing across the dark surface like liquid metal. Ezra Colt, mountain man of the high country, entered on the 23rd day of October, in the year of our Lord 2024, carrying his beloved Sarah in his heart and his faithful Blue waiting beyond these walls. He seeks answers to questions that can only be asked in solitude. The castle has been waiting. The sight of his own name appearing on what was clearly a memorial to the lost and disappeared sent a shock through Ezra that was part fear, part recognition, and part something that might have been relief. Here was confirmation that he was not the first to discover this place, that others before him had faced the same impossible choice between the safety of the familiar world and the promise of reuniting with what they had lost. But it was also confirmation of something. He had begun to suspect that those who entered this castle did not leave. Blue's howling had changed again, taking on a frantic quality that spoke of genuine distress. The sound seemed to come from directly overhead now, as if his faithful companion was somehow above him, though Ezra knew he was still at ground level within the castle. The supernatural acoustics of this place were distorting sound in ways that made it impossible to determine Blue's actual location, but the emotion in those calls was unmistakable. The dog was not just confused or frightened, he was terrified. The chronicle stone continued to write, adding details to Ezra's entry that he had not spoken aloud. He carries his grandfather's compass, which spins true only in the presence of forces that bend the natural order. He bears an iron key that burns with welcome fire. He has seen his beloved's face in the sentinel's shield and knows the weight of memories made manifest. The castle recognizes its own. This last line disturbed Ezra more than anything else he had encountered. The castle recognizes its own, as if he somehow belonged here, as if his presence was not an accident but a fulfillment of some long-standing destiny. The iron key pulsed in response to his thoughts, its warmth now so intense that maintaining his grip required genuine determination. Around the circular chamber, he began to notice details that had not been visible when he first entered. Alcoves carved into the stone walls held objects that seemed to glow with their own internal light. A surveyor's transit that must have belonged to William Hartwell. A lace handkerchief that might have been Margaret O'Sullivan's. A military medal that could have been Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's. Each alcove held artifacts that spoke of lives lived and lost, dreams abandoned and hopes destroyed. One alcove remained empty, waiting, the realization of what that empty space represented, what it was waiting for, sent Ezra stumbling backward from the chronicle stone. He understood now that this was not just a record of those who had entered the castle, but a catalogue of those who had chosen to stay, who had surrendered their connections to the outside world in exchange for whatever comfort or reunion this supernatural place offered. But even as horror at this revelation washed over him, another part of his mind, the part that had been hollow and aching since Sarah's death, whispered that perhaps surrender would not be such a terrible thing. If others had found peace here, if the promise of reunion with lost loved ones was real rather than cruel illusion, then maybe the empty alcove was not a threat but an invitation. The mysterious music swelled around him, and for a moment Ezra could swear he heard Sarah's voice woven into the melody, not singing, but speaking his name with the same gentle affection she had used during their 23 years together. The sound was so real, so achingly familiar, that he turned toward the chamber's exit, following the voice that might or might not have been calling to him from deeper in the castle's supernatural depths. Behind him, the chronicle stone continued to write, adding line after line to his entry, documenting thoughts and feelings he had not realized were so transparent to whatever force controlled this place. But Ezra no longer looked back at the stone. His attention was fixed on the passages ahead, where Sarah's voice seemed to be leading him toward answers that might cost him everything he had left to lose. Sarah's voice grew stronger as Ezra climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to wind upward through the very heart of the castle. The iron key burned in his palm now, its heat so intense that blisters should have formed, yet his flesh remained unmarked. The key's light had grown bright enough to illuminate the stone steps ahead, revealing worn grooves where countless feet had passed before his own. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in what appeared to be a private chamber, smaller than the great hall below, but furnished with impossible luxury for a place that should have been abandoned for decades or centuries. Tapestries covered the walls, their colors rich and vibrant as if they had been woven yesterday. A fire burned merrily in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames that created them. But it was the table beside the fire that stopped Ezra's breath in his throat. There, glinting in the firelight, lay Sarah's locket, the simple gold pendant he had given her on their first anniversary, which she had worn every day until the cancer made even small jewelry too heavy for her weakened frame. He had buried it with her, placing it in her folded hands before they closed the casket for the last time. Yet here it was, impossible as everything else in this cursed place. With trembling fingers, Ezra reached for the locket, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage the moment he touched it. But the gold was solid and warm under his fingertips, engraved with the words he had chosen so many years ago. To Sarah, who makes the mountains sing, The tiny catch opened just as it always had, revealing the miniature photograph inside. Sarah at 25, her hair caught in mountain wind, her eyes bright with laughter and love. Except the photograph was moving. As Ezra watched in fascination and growing horror, the tiny image showed Sarah turning her head, her lips moving as if she were speaking. When he lifted the locket closer to his ear, he could hear her voice, distant and whispered, but unmistakably hers. "Ezra," the tiny Sarah was saying, "I'm here. I've been waiting for you. Come find me." The voice was coming not just from the locket, but from somewhere deeper in the castle. Sarah was calling to him from the floors above, her voice echoing down through stone passages in a way that defied physics and reason. But the emotional impact was devastating. After 5 years of silence, of talking to her grave marker, and hearing only the wind in response, Sarah was speaking to him again. "I know you're confused, my love," the locket continued, the miniature Sarah's lips moving in perfect synchronization with words that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This place is strange, but it's real. I'm real. We can be together again, Ezra. All you have to do is come to me." The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 6 decades of mountain winters and dangerous hunts, screamed warnings. This was not Sarah, could not be Sarah. His wife was dead and buried in the Millbrook Cemetery, her body returned to the earth they had both loved so much. What he was seeing and hearing was some supernatural trick, designed to trap him, just as the Chronicle Stone had documented happening to dozens before him. But the emotional part of his mind, the part that had been broken and hollow since her death, seized on the possibility with desperate hunger. What if death was not the ending he had believed it to be? What if love could transcend the boundaries between worlds? What if this impossible castle existed specifically to reunite those who had been separated by mortality's cruel division? Through the chamber's windows, Ezra could see Blue pacing in the moonlight far below. The distance seemed much greater than it should have been. The castle's towers stretched higher than he remembered, as if the structure was growing even as he climbed through it. Blue appeared as small as a toy from this height, yet his distress was clearly visible in the rigid set of his posture and the frantic pattern of his movements. The sight of his faithful companions' anguish cut through the emotional fog that Sarah's voice had created. Blue had never led him wrong, had never failed to sense danger before it struck. If the dog was terrified of this place, if every instinct that had kept them both alive through countless wilderness adventures was screaming warnings, then Ezra needed to listen. But even as he formed this resolution, Sarah's voice grew stronger, more immediate. "I can see you through the windows, my darling," she said. And now her voice seemed to come from directly behind him. "You look so tired, so worn down by grief. You don't have to carry that weight anymore. Come to me, and we can rest together." Ezra spun around, but the chamber was empty except for the dancing shadows cast by the supernatural fire. Yet he could feel her presence now, as real and tangible as the stone floor beneath his feet. The air carried her scent, the lavender soap she had favored, the wood smoke that had clung to her hair from their cabin's fireplace, the indefinable sweetness that had been uniquely hers. "The top floor," her voice continued, seeming to move through the chamber like a gentle breeze. "I'm waiting in the highest tower. The view is beautiful from up there. You can see all the mountains we loved, stretching away forever. Bring the key, Ezra. It will unlock the door to where I'm waiting." The iron key pulsed in response to her words, its glow intensifying until the entire chamber was lit by its radiance. The warmth had become almost unbearable, yet Ezra found himself unable to release it. The key wanted to be carried upward, wanted to fulfill whatever purpose had brought it into his possession. From outside came a sound that made him freeze. Blue was howling again, but this time the calls were different. They carried a pattern, a rhythm that Ezra recognized from their years together in the wilderness. It was the signal Blue used when he had cornered dangerous prey, the warning that told his master to approach with caution and be ready to fight. But what could Blue have cornered outside an empty castle? What danger could exist in the moonlit valley that would trigger such specific warnings? Unless the danger was not outside the castle at all. Unless Blue was trying to warn him that something was moving through the structure itself, something that the dog's supernatural senses could detect even from a distance. The thought sent ice through Ezra's veins, even as Sarah's voice continued to call to him from the floors above. The locket in his hand grew warm, and when he looked down at it again, the miniature photograph had changed. Now it showed Sarah not as she had been in life, but as she might appear if she'd been waiting in this castle for 5 years, pale, translucent, with eyes that held depths of sorrow and longing that no living person should possess. "Please, Ezra," the locket whispered. "I've been alone for so long. Don't leave me waiting anymore." The final staircase was carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the unsettling impression that Ezra was climbing into a void. The iron key had become so hot that he was forced to wrap it in his handkerchief, though even through the fabric he could feel its urgent pulsing. Sarah's voice had grown stronger with each step upward, but now other voices had joined hers, whispered conversations that seemed to drift from the very walls of the castle itself. At the top of the tower, Ezra found himself in a circular chamber unlike anything he had encountered in the lower floors. The walls were made entirely of crystal or glass, some material so clear and perfect that it seemed like solidified air. But it was not the architecture that stole his breath and nearly brought him to his knees. In the center of the chamber stood the heart. Stone, the massive crystalline formation, rose 12 feet from floor to ceiling, its faceted surface pulsing with internal light that shifted through every color Ezra had ever seen, and several that he was certain had no names. The crystal was beautiful beyond description, but it was what existed within its depths that made him stagger backward in shock and awe. Trapped within the heartstone, like insects preserved in ancient amber, were human figures, dozens of them, suspended in the crystal's heart with their faces turned outward, their mouths open as if calling for help that would never come. Some wore clothing from decades past, others from centuries gone by. He recognized the uniform of a railroad surveyor, the rough garments of a mountain trapper, the elegant dress of a woman from the Victorian era. And there, near the crystal's heart, was Sarah. She looked exactly as she had on their wedding day, young and radiant, her hair flowing around her face like spun gold, her eyes bright with love and laughter. But as Ezra watched, those beloved eyes found his through the crystal, and her mouth moved in silent words that he could somehow hear as clearly as if she stood beside him. "You came for me. I knew you would come." The voices he had been hearing throughout the castle were emanating from the Heartstone, the trapped souls speaking to each other, to him, to anyone who might hear their pleas. Some begged for release, others warned him to flee. But Sarah's voice rose above them all, sweet and loving and utterly convincing. "The key, darling," she said, and now her voice came not just from the crystal, but from the air around him, from the very stones of the tower itself. "There's a place for it at the base of the stone. Turn the key, and we can be together forever. No more loneliness, no more grief, no more watching the seasons change without someone to share them." Ezra approached the Heartstone with trembling legs, and indeed found a keyhole carved into its base, a perfect fit for the iron key that burned in his wrapped hand. The figures within the crystal pressed closer to the surface as he drew near, their faces desperate with hope and warning in equal measure. But Sarah's image remained calm and loving, her lips curved in the gentle smile he remembered from countless quiet evenings by their cabin's fire. "I know you're frightened," she continued, her voice now so clear it seemed to come from inside his own head. "I was frightened too when I first arrived. But there's no pain here, Ezra, no sickness, no aging, no death. Just us together with all the time we were denied in life." The other figures in the crystal were becoming more agitated, their mouths moving in what appeared to be urgent warnings. But their voices were overwhelmed by Sarah's sweet tones. Only one sound managed to penetrate the supernatural chorus, Blue's howling from far below. now so frantic and desperate that it sounded more like screaming than any noise a dog should make. That sound, more than anything else, cut through the fog of desire and desperation that had been clouding Ezra's judgment. Blue was not just frightened, he was in agony. The faithful companion who had never left his side, who had shared every joy and sorrow of the past 10 years, was suffering because of choices Ezra was making in this impossible place. "Don't listen to him," Sarah's voice said. And for the first time, there was an edge of urgency to her tone. "He's just an animal, Ezra. He can't understand what we have, what we mean to each other. Use the key, set me free, and we can be together forever." But as Ezra stared into the Heartstone, studying the faces of the trapped souls within, he began to notice details that chilled him to the bone. Their expressions were not peaceful or content, as Sarah claimed. They were horrified, desperate, filled with the anguish of beings who had made a terrible mistake and could not undo it. Some were screaming silently, their faces contorted with terror. Others pressed their hands against the crystal's inner surface, pushing desperately against a barrier they could not break. And Sarah, when he looked at her more carefully, he could see that her perfect beauty was an illusion. Like the others, her face showed traces of the same desperate terror, the same realization of having been deceived. Only when she spoke to him did the illusion of peace and contentment overlay her true expression. The iron key was now so hot that it was burning through the handkerchief, searing his palm despite the fabric barrier. But the pain helped clear his mind, helped him think past the emotional manipulation that had been guiding his steps since he first crossed the castle's threshold. This was not Sarah, whatever this thing was that wore his wife's face and spoke with her voice. It was not the woman he had loved and lost. Sarah would never ask him to abandon Blue, would never try to convince him to cut himself off from the world of the living. The real Sarah would want him to heal, to find new purposes and connections, to honor their love by continuing to live fully even after she was gone. The Heartstone pulsed brighter as these thoughts crossed his mind, and the Sarah thing within it began to change. Her beautiful face twisted with anger and frustration as she realized he was beginning to see through her deception. "You're making a mistake," she snarled, her voice no longer sweet but harsh with supernatural rage. "You'll never find peace without me. You'll grow old and die alone, just another bitter hermit talking to ghosts in an empty cabin." But even as the illusion crumbled, Ezra found himself holding the iron key over the waiting keyhole. The crystal's pull was almost irresistible, promising an end to loneliness, an escape from the pain of living with loss. All he had to do was turn the key, and he would never have to face another empty evening, another quiet meal, another night of dreams, where Sarah was alive only to wake and remember she was gone. Below in the valley, Blue's cries had taken on a new quality, not just fear now, but heartbreak. The dog knew, with the instinct that had evolved over millennia of partnership with humans, that his master was slipping away from him, choosing death over life, illusion over reality. That sound, the sound of his faithful companion's breaking heart, finally gave Ezra the strength to step back from the Heartstone and the promise of false reunion it offered. As Ezra stepped back from the Heartstone, his foot struck something metallic on the crystal floor. Looking down, he discovered an ancient hammer, not the crude tool of a common laborer, but an instrument of power and craftsmanship that seemed to hum with its own inner energy. The builder's hammer, as his mind immediately named it, was wrought from the same dark iron as the key, its head inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The moment his fingers closed around the hammer's handle, the world changed. Visions flooded his mind with such intensity that he cried out and nearly fell to his knees. He saw the truth of this place, not an ancient castle built by long-dead kings, but something far more disturbing and immediate. The castle was not old at all. It had materialized in this valley only 5 years ago, rising from nothing in the space between one heartbeat and the next, constructed not by human hands, but by the raw force of grief itself. His grief. Ezra's grief, the hammer, showed him the night Sarah died, when he had sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, as her breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. In that moment of ultimate loss, when the foundation of his world cracked and fell away, something had been born in the spiritual realm, a hunger, a desperate need that reached across the boundaries between life and death, seeking reunion at any cost. That need had taken shape and substance, drawing on his memories of medieval castles from books Sarah had loved to read, from movies they had watched together on quiet winter evenings. It had pulled stone and timber from the earth itself, weaving them into a structure that existed partially in the physical world and partially in the realm of human longing. The castle was not a trap built by some ancient evil. It was his own creation, manifested through the sheer intensity of his inability to let Sarah go. But the builder's hammer revealed more than just the castle's origin. It showed him others across history and around the world who had experienced loss so profound that it tore holes in reality itself. A woman in Victorian London whose grief for her children had created a phantom nursery that lured other bereaved parents to their doom. A Civil War soldier whose anguish over fallen comrades had spawned a battlefield that appeared to new visitors every year on the anniversary of the massacre. A mother in ancient Rome whose sorrow had built a temple that promised reunion with the dead, only to trap the living in eternal servitude to grief. Every person whose name appeared on the chronicle stone had not simply discovered this castle, they had created it, drawn to this valley by the resonance between their own loss and the supernatural monument to mourning that Ezra's pain had built. Each new arrival had added their own anguish to the structure, making it stronger, more convincing, more deadly in its false promises. The Heartstone was not a prison for trapped souls, but a battery that fed on the emotional energy of those who could not release their dead. Every person who entered the castle and chose to stay, who turned the iron key and accepted the illusion of reunion, added their life force to the crystal's power. They were not truly reunited with their lost loved ones. They were consumed by their own inability to accept loss, becoming fuel for a supernatural engine that created increasingly convincing phantoms of what they most desired to see. Sarah had never been in this castle at all. The figure he had seen in the Heartstone, the voice that had called to him through the chambers and corridors, was nothing more than his own memory and longing given form and voice by the castle's hungry power. He had been talking to himself all along, seduced by his own grief made manifest. The realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. If he had created this place, if his unresolved anguish was the foundation on which it stood, then he also had the power to unmake it. The builder's hammer was not just a tool for construction, it was an instrument of destruction, capable of tearing down what grief had built when wielded by hands that finally understood the difference between love and possession, between memory and obsession. But first, he had to make a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every soul that had become trapped in this monument to mourning. The false Sarah in the Heartstone had fallen silent, her beautiful features replaced by something that resembled his wife only in the most superficial ways. Around her, the other trapped figures pressed against the crystal surface with renewed urgency, their silent screams speaking of decades or centuries spent in a hell of false hope and eternal disappointment. The iron key still burned in his wrapped hand, offering the same escape it had promised every other grieving soul who had found their way to this valley. He could still turn it, still join Sarah, or the thing that wore her face, in the crystal's heart. The loneliness would end, the pain would stop, and he would never again have to wake up in an empty cabin or eat dinner at a table set for one. But Blue's cries from outside had changed again. No longer desperate or heartbroken, they carried a different message now. Determination mixed with hope. The dog had not given up on his master. After hours of frantic pacing and useless howling, Blue had settled into the patient vigil that both of them had learned during long hunts in the deep wilderness. He was waiting for Ezra to remember who he was, to choose life over the seductive promise of an eternal sleep. The choice was simple, but not easy. Ezra could use the builder's hammer to destroy the heartstone and free the trapped souls, accepting that doing so would also destroy his last connection to Sarah, even the false one that this place provided. Or he could surrender to the grief that had controlled his life for 5 years, adding his strength to the castle's power and ensuring that others would be drawn to this valley to face the same impossible choice. Standing in the crystal chamber with the iron key burning, his palm and the builder's hammer heavy in his other hand, Ezra thought of Sarah as she truly had been, not the perfect phantom that haunted this place, but the real woman who had loved him enough to want his happiness even after her death. The real Sarah would be horrified to know that her memory had become a weapon used to trap and destroy others. She would want him to choose the harder path, the path of healing and growth, and eventually, perhaps peace. The heartstone pulsed with hungry light, waiting for his decision while outside in the valley. Blue maintained his faithful vigil, trusting that the man who had shared his life for 10 years would remember what it meant to choose love over loss, hope over despair, life over the beautiful lie of eternal reunion with the dead. The decision, when it came, arrived not as a moment of sudden clarity, but as the slow, inevitable result of a lifetime spent learning what it meant to love truly. Ezra looked at the builder's hammer in his hand, heavy with purpose, vibrating with potential, and understood what he had to do. But first, he needed to prepare for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult battle of his life. The castle would not give up its trapped souls willingly. Built from grief and sustained by the life force of those who had chosen illusion over reality, it would fight to preserve itself with every supernatural power at its disposal. Ezra could feel its awareness pressing against his mind, probing for weaknesses, searching for the emotional leverage that would make him reconsider his choice. Setting the builder's hammer carefully on the crystal floor, he began to examine the chamber with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through 6 decades of mountain survival. The walls were crystal, certainly, but they were not uniform in thickness or clarity. Some sections pulsed with the same rhythm as the heartstone, while others remained relatively dim. These dimmer areas, he realized, were structural weak points, places where the castle's supernatural architecture was less stable, more vulnerable to physical disruption. He pulled out his grandfather's compass and was not surprised to find that it was spinning wildly, its needle unable to find true north in a place where the natural laws of physics bent to accommodate impossible grief. But when he held it near the dim sections of wall, the spinning slowed, and occasionally the needle would point steadily towards specific spots on the crystal surface. His grandfather's compass, it seemed, could detect not just magnetic north, but also the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. The iron key continued to burn in his wrapped hand, but now he understood its true purpose. It was not meant to free the trapped souls by turning in the heartstone's base. That would only add his essence to their prison. Instead, the key was a focus, a way to channel his will and determination into the physical destruction of what his grief had built. When combined with the builder's hammer, it would give him the power to tear down the castle's supernatural foundations, but the process would require more than physical strength. To destroy a structure built from emotion, he would need to confront and overcome the very feelings that had given it birth. Every blow of the hammer against the heartstone would force him to face another aspect of his unresolved grief, another way he had clung to Sarah's memory instead of honoring it properly. From the trapped souls within the crystal came a chorus of voices, no longer disguised or manipulated by the castle's deceptive power. Now he could hear their true words, their authentic selves, crying out for the release that only he could provide. "Please," whispered the surveyor who had entered in 1887. "I've been lost in these halls for over a century. My wife is long dead now. She remarried, lived a full life, died peacefully in her sleep. But I'm still here, chasing phantoms of a woman who stopped waiting for me decades ago. My children, wept the Victorian woman. I thought I could save them, thought I could bring them back. But they don't want to be saved. They want to rest. I see that now. Please, let us all rest. The war, muttered Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, his voice heavy with the weight of decades spent reliving his trauma. It ended 77 years ago. The boys I lost, they found their peace long before I did. I should have let them go, should have learned to carry their memory without letting it destroy me. Each voice added to Ezra's understanding of what he was attempting to do. This was not just about freeing these particular souls, but about breaking a cycle that had claimed dozens of lives across more than a century. People would continue to be drawn to this valley as long as the castle stood, would continue to face the same impossible choice between healing and surrender, between life and the seductive promise of reunion with the dead. Outside, Blue's vigil had taken on a different quality. The frantic pacing and heartbroken howling had given way to something that reminded Ezra of the way his companion behaved during their hunts. Patient, alert, ready to act the moment his help was needed. The dog seemed to sense that something crucial was about to happen, that his master was preparing for a confrontation that would determine both their fates. Ezra moved to one of the chamber's crystal windows and looked down at Blue's small form in the moonlit valley below. The distance seemed impossible. The tower had grown even taller during his time within it, stretching toward the star-filled sky like a monument to human folly. But Blue was still there, still maintaining his faithful watch, trusting in a bond that had been forged through 10 years of shared adventure and mutual dependence. That trust, more than anything else, gave Ezra the strength he needed to begin his preparations. He used his pocket knife to carve marks on the crystal floor, creating a rough map of the chamber and marking the weak points his grandfather's compass had revealed. The liberation bell, as he found himself thinking of it, hung from the chamber's apex, a bronze bell that he had not noticed during his initial shock at discovering the Heartstone. Now he could see that it was connected to the castle's structure in ways that suggested great significance. Somehow he knew that ringing that bell at the right moment would be crucial to the liberation he planned to attempt. The false Sarah had been silent since his refusal to turn the iron key, but now her voice returned, not sweet and manipulative as before, but angry and desperate. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she snarled from within the Heartstone. "I'm offering you everything you've wanted for 5 years. No more loneliness, no more waking up to empty rooms, no more pretending that life has meaning without me. Turn the key, Ezra. Join me and we can be together forever." But her words no longer carried the emotional weight they once had. Ezra could see through the illusion now, could recognize his own voice speaking back to him through the supernatural amplifier of his unresolved grief. This was not Sarah trying to convince him. This was his own weakness, his own fear of facing life without her. Given form and voice by the castle's malevolent power, "Sarah never wanted me to stop living," he said aloud, speaking not to the phantom in the crystal, but to himself, working through the thoughts and feelings that had driven him to create this place. "She used to joke about haunting me if I didn't remarry after she was gone. Said she'd rattle chains and slam doors until I found someone new to take care of." The phantom's face twisted with rage at these words, but Ezra continued, each sentence helping to weaken the emotional foundations on which the castle stood. "She loved Blue almost as much as I do. She'd never ask me to abandon him, never try to make me choose between her memory and his life. The real Sarah would be heartbroken to know that I've spent 5 years talking to ghosts instead of living." The Heartstone's light began to flicker as these truths found their mark. Around the chamber, hairline cracks appeared in the crystal walls, tiny fractures that spread slowly but inexorably as Ezra's growing understanding undermined the supernatural structure's stability. He picked up the builder's hammer and unwrapped the iron key, accepting the searing pain as the price of the power he would need. The bronze liberation bell began to vibrate, responding to the proximity of the tools that would either free the trapped souls or destroy him in the attempt. Blue's howl drifted up from the valley below, not desperate now, but encouraging, as if the dog could sense that his master had finally chosen the harder but truer path. With the builder's hammer in one hand and the glowing iron key in the other, Ezra Colt prepared to tear down the monument to grief that his broken heart had built, and in doing so, to finally set both himself and Sarah's memory free. The first blow of the builder's hammer against the heartstone sent shockwaves through the entire castle. Crystal walls rang like enormous bells, and the floor beneath Ezra's feet cracked in a spiderweb of fractures that spread outward from the point of impact. The iron key in his other hand blazed with white-hot light, and the phantom Sarah within the stone shrieked with a voice that was no longer even pretending to be human. But as the hammer struck, Ezra was assaulted by a wave of memory so intense it nearly drove him to his knees. He saw Sarah during their courtship, 19 years old, laughing as she tried to bait his fishing hook with trembling fingers, insisting she could do it herself, even though the sight of the worm made her queasy. The memory was perfect in every detail, from the way the morning sun caught the gold highlights in her brown hair to the small scar on her thumb from a childhood accident with her father's wood plane. The castle was fighting back, using his own cherished memories as weapons against him. Each recollection was carefully chosen to remind him of what he had lost, to make him question whether destroying this place was worth giving up even the illusion of having Sarah back. Ezra gritted his teeth and swung the hammer again. This time he saw Sarah on their wedding day, radiant in the simple white dress she had sewn herself, promising to love him through whatever hardships the mountains might bring. The image was so vivid he could smell her perfume, could feel the trembling of her hands as she placed the ring on his finger. "Stop," he whispered through clenched teeth, but he did not stop swinging. Each blow opened new cracks in the heartstone, releasing pulses of supernatural energy that made the entire tower sway. The trapped souls within the crystal were becoming more visible now, pressing against the fractures from the inside, adding their strength to his efforts at liberation. The third blow brought a memory of Sarah during their first winter together, when a blizzard had trapped them in their cabin for 6 days. She had turned their isolation into an adventure, telling stories by the fireplace, teaching him card games her grandmother had shown her, making love with a passion that had kept them warm even when the wood supply ran dangerously low. With the fourth blow, he saw her tending their small garden, her face flushed with pride as she showed him the first tomatoes to ripen. She had been so excited, chattering about canning and preserving, planning ahead to the harsh months when fresh vegetables would be nothing but a memory. The false Sarah in the crystal had stopped shrieking and was now pleading, her voice taking on the exact cadence and tone of his real wife during her final weeks. "Please don't leave me here alone," she whispered. "I'm so frightened, Ezra. The darkness is so cold, and I can't find my way out. Help me." But Ezra had learned to distinguish between authentic memory and supernatural manipulation. The real Sarah had never been frightened of death. During those final weeks, she had faced the end with a courage that had humbled him, spending her remaining strength not on self-pity, but on preparing him for a life without her. She had made lists of practical matters, which bills came when, how to care for the chickens, where she kept the spare keys to everything. She had talked about the future as if he would have one worth living, had made him promise to take care of Blue and to find new purposes when the grief finally loosened its grip. The fifth blow shattered a section of the heartstone completely, and through the gap poured the essence of the surveyor who had been trapped since 1887. His soul rose like smoke, taking the form of a middle-aged man in Victorian clothing who turned to Ezra with tears of gratitude streaming down his translucent face. "Thank you," he whispered before dissolving into particles of light that drifted toward the chamber's crystal ceiling and passed through it as if it were no barrier at all. "Thank you for letting me go home." The castle screamed around them, not with human voices now, but with the sound of supernatural architecture tearing itself apart. The crystal walls began to crack in earnest, sending shards falling like deadly rain. Ezra had to dodge falling debris while continuing his assault on the Heartstone, each swing guided by the iron key's blazing light. With the sixth blow, the Victorian woman was freed, her spirit rising with words of blessing for her children who had found peace decades before her. The seventh blow released a mountain man who had been trapped since the 1920s. His soul ascending with the tip of his hat and a grin that spoke of trails finally found again. But the castle was not giving up its prizes easily. As each trapped soul was freed, the supernatural forces holding the structure together fought back with increasing desperation. The crystal floor began to buckle and warp, creating treacherous footing that threatened to send Ezra tumbling into the growing chasms. The walls themselves seemed to reach for him with crystalline tendrils, trying to trap him as they had trapped the others through it all. Blue's voice could be heard from the valley below, no longer the desperate howling of earlier, but strong, encouraging barks that reminded Ezra he was not alone in this battle. The sound of his companion's support gave him strength to continue, even as the chamber collapsed around him. The eighth blow freed Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, whose departing words were a soldier's salute and a whispered, "Mission accomplished." The ninth released a woman from the 1960s who had lost 3 sons in Vietnam, her spirit ascending with a mother's blessing for the living. With each freed soul, the false Sarah in the Heartstone became less convincing, more obviously a construction of his own unresolved grief. Her perfect features began to blur and shift, sometimes showing Sarah as she had been in life, sometimes revealing the hollow-eyed phantom she truly was. But it was the 10th blow that brought the most challenging test of all. As the hammer struck the stone and more cracks appeared, Ezra was hit not with a memory of Sarah, but with a vision of what their life together might have been if cancer had never stolen her away. He saw them growing old together, saw her gray-haired and wrinkled but still beautiful, still laughing at his stories, still sharing the quiet contentment that had marked their best years together. The vision was so perfect, so achingly beautiful, that he nearly dropped the hammer. This was what he was giving up, not just the illusion of having Sarah back, but the dream of what they might have shared if fate had been kinder. For a moment, the temptation to stop, to accept the castle's offer of eternal reunion, even if it was false, was almost overwhelming. But then he heard Blue's bark again, and with it came a different understanding. The real Sarah would not want him to sacrifice his faithful companion for a lie. She would not want him to trap himself in a prison of false memories when he still had love to give and receive in the world of the living. The vision of their imagined future was beautiful, but it was not real, and choosing illusion over reality would dishonor everything their actual relationship had meant. The 11th blow sent cracks racing through the Heartstone's core, reaching toward the false Sarah at its center. Her phantom form began to waver and fragment, her voice rising to an inhuman shriek that spoke of a supernatural entity finally facing destruction. With the 12th blow, Ezra found himself face to face not with Sarah, but with his own reflection distorted by grief and longing. The thing in the Heartstone was not his wife's spirit at all. It was his own inability to accept loss, his own weakness made manifest and given voice. The 13th blow shattered the Heartstone's central chamber, and suddenly Ezra found himself surrounded by the memory mirror, a swirling vortex of images and reflections that showed not just his memories of Sarah, but the truth about what those memories had become. He saw himself sitting alone in their cabin night after night, talking to her empty chair as if she was still there to listen. He saw himself tending her grave with obsessive care, bringing fresh flowers every week, even when the snow was knee-deep. He saw himself pushing away neighbors who had offered friendship, refusing invitations to community gatherings, turning down the gentle advances of a widow from town who had genuinely cared for him. The mirror showed him the difference between treasuring memories and being imprisoned by them. In one reflection, he saw what honoring Sarah's memory could have looked like, staying connected to the community they had both loved. Perhaps teaching young people the mountain skills his grandfather had passed down to him, carrying forward the warmth and generosity that had defined her life. In another, he saw himself as he had actually become, isolated, bitter, slowly dying of loneliness, while claiming to honor a love that had been built on shared joy and mutual support. "This is what I became," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the collapsing chamber. "This is what I let her death turn me into," the false Sarah's image twisted and warped in the mirror's depths, revealing itself finally as nothing more than his own fear of moving forward. His own terror of dishonoring her memory by learning to be happy again. She was not trying to save him. She was trying to preserve the pain that had become his only remaining connection to what they had shared. But as the memory mirror swirled around him, it also showed him moments he had forgotten. Times when the real Sarah had talked about death not with fear, but with practical acceptance. He remembered her saying, during one of their long walks in the mountains, that she hoped he would find someone else to love if she died first. "Promise me you won't become one of those old hermits who talks to his coffee cup," she had said, laughing but serious underneath. "Promise me you'll stay connected to people, that you'll let yourself be happy again," he had promised. But he had broken that promise in the 5 years since her death. The 14th blow of the builder's hammer sent the memory mirror spinning apart in fragments of truth and reflection. Each shard showed him a different choice he could have made, a different path he could have taken. The images were not meant to torment him, but to show him that it was not too late, that even now, even after 5 years of choosing isolation over healing, he could still honor Sarah's memory by choosing to live fully. The liberation bell above them began to ring without being touched, its bronze voice filling the collapsing chamber with a sound that was both mournful and hopeful. Each peal seemed to free another trapped soul, their essence rising through the crystal ceiling like prayers ascending to whatever lay beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The false Sarah made one last desperate attempt to maintain her hold over him. Her form solidified in the ruins of the Heartstone, taking on not the appearance of his wife, but his own face, twisted with grief and self-pity. "You'll never be happy without her," his own voice said through the phantom's lips. "Every sunrise will remind you of mornings she'll never see. Every meal will taste like ash, because she's not there to share it. Every sunset will be a countdown to another night of sleeping alone. You might as well stay here with us, at least here the pain has purpose." But Ezra was no longer listening to the voice of his own despair. Instead, he heard Blue's bark from the valley below, and in that sound he heard something he had forgotten, the simple, uncomplicated love of a being who lived fully in each moment, who grieved losses but did not let them consume him, who offered loyalty and affection, not because of what had been, but because of what was. "Sarah loved Blue too," Ezra said, raising the builder's hammer for what he knew would be the final blow. "She would never forgive me for choosing grief over the love that's still available to me." The 15th and final blow shattered what remained of the Heartstone completely. The phantom Sarah, his own grief made manifest, screamed once and dissolved into nothing, taking with her 5 years of self-imposed suffering and isolation. The last of the trapped souls rose like stars ascending to their proper places in the night sky, each one pausing to offer thanks before disappearing into whatever peace awaited beyond the veil of mortality, the liberation bells. Vinyl Peel was so pure and clear that it seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. As its echoes faded, the crystal chamber began to collapse in earnest, not violently, but with the slow, inevitable dissolution of something that had never truly belonged in the physical world. Ezra felt the floor giving way beneath his feet and realized that he had moments, perhaps seconds, before the entire tower came down. The iron key in his hand had gone cold and dark, its purpose fulfilled, while the builder's hammer dissolved into particles of light that scattered like fireflies in the collapsing chamber. Through the crystal walls, he could see Blue racing toward the base of the tower, his faithful companion having somehow sensed that the moment of greatest danger was at hand. The sight of that small, determined figure gave Ezra the final surge of strength he needed to leap for the chamber's single window, trusting that love and determination would be enough to carry him back to the world of the living. Dawn was breaking over the high country when Ezra opened his eyes to find himself lying in soft grass beside Bear Creek, with Blue's warm tongue washing the cuts and bruises from his face. The castle was gone, as if it had never been. No ruins, no foundation stones, no trace of the supernatural monument to grief that had dominated this valley for 5 years. The only evidence of what had transpired was the strange collection of objects scattered around him. An antique surveyor's transit, a Victorian lace handkerchief, a military medal from the Great War, and dozens of other artifacts that had once belonged to the souls he had helped free. But the most important artifact of all was still with him. Blue's simple leather collar, worn smooth by years of mountain adventures, still buckled around the neck of the most loyal friend he had ever known. The collar represented everything the supernatural treasures had promised, but could never deliver. Love that existed in the present moment. Companionship that asked for nothing but offered everything. Loyalty that endured not because of what had been lost, but because of what remained. Ezra sat up slowly, his body aching from the night's ordeal, but his mind clearer than it had been in 5 years. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and snow, the promise of winter still weeks away, but already whispering in the wind. It was the same air he had breathed for 62 years, the same mountains that had sheltered his family for 3 generations, but somehow everything felt different. Not changed exactly, renewed. Blue pressed against his side, and Ezra buried his fingers in the dog's thick fur, feeling the solid warmth of life and presence. For the first time since Sarah's death, the gesture did not bring pain, but comfort, not because his grief was gone, but because he finally understood the difference between carrying love and being crushed by it. "I'm sorry. Old friend," he whispered into Blue's ear. "I'm sorry I made you wait so long for me to come back to the world." As if in response, Blue's tail began to wag, not the frantic motion of relief, but the steady rhythm that meant all was right in his simple, honest world. His master had returned from whatever dark place he had been wandering, and that was enough. They made their way back toward the cabin together, following familiar trails through country that had welcomed Ezra's family for generations. But now he found himself noticing things he had missed during 5 years of walking through life like a ghost. The way the aspen leaves caught the morning light like golden coins, the complex symphony of bird calls that greeted each new day, the intricate patterns of frost that painted the meadow grass in delicate crystal. At the cabin, Ezra made coffee and breakfast for 2, himself and Blue, who had earned a share of eggs and bacon after his loyal vigil. As they ate together on the porch, watching the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold, Ezra found himself thinking not of Sarah's absence, but of her presence in the memories he chose to treasure. He remembered her voice saying, "Promise me you won't become one of those old hermits who talks to his coffee cup." The memory no longer brought pain, but something that might have been gentle amusement. He had become exactly that hermit, had broken his promise to her and to himself. But promises, like hearts, could be mended if a man had the courage to begin again. Over the following weeks, Ezra began to make changes that would have seemed impossible just a month before. He drove down to Millbrook and accepted Murphy's long-standing invitation to join the morning coffee group, where his stories of mountain life and wilderness survival made him welcome company. He volunteered to teach wilderness skills to the local scout troop, sharing knowledge that his grandfather had passed to him and that deserved to survive beyond his own lifetime. Most surprising of all, when Martha Henderson, the widow who had brought him casseroles and conversation during Sarah's illness, shyly invited him to the harvest dance at the community center, he found himself saying yes. Not because he was ready to replace what he had lost, but because he was finally ready to honor it by remaining open to whatever new connections life might offer. The artifacts from the vanished castle had been scattered by the wind, returning to the earth, or perhaps to whatever realm supernatural objects inhabited when their purposes were fulfilled. But Ezra kept one small reminder of that night, his grandfather's brass compass, which now pointed steadily toward true north, as it was meant to do. Sometimes, when he held it in the morning sunlight, he fancied he could see a reflection of Sarah's face in its glass. Not the phantom that had haunted the castle, but the real woman who had loved him enough to want his happiness even after she was gone. Blue aged gracefully beside him, their bond deepened by the shared understanding of loyalty tested and proven. When the dog finally passed, peacefully in his sleep after 13 years of faithful companionship, Ezra grieved honestly, but did not retreat into isolation. He had learned the difference between honoring loss and being consumed by it, between memory as a prison and memory as a gift. He kept Blue's collar in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, next to a photograph of Sarah taken during their happiest years. Sometimes visitors would ask about these mementos, and Ezra would tell them stories, not of supernatural castles or impossible reunions, but of love that endures through change, of loyalty that enriches life rather than limiting it, of the courage required to remain open to joy, even after experiencing profound loss. The high country, where his family had lived for 3 generations, continued to change with the seasons. Snow giving way to spring wildflowers, summer storms yielding to autumn gold. But now, Ezra walked those familiar trails with eyes open to their beauty rather than blind with grief, ready to share their lessons with anyone willing to learn that the deepest bonds are forged not in clinging to what is gone, but in treasuring what remains and remaining open to what might yet come. In the end, that was Sarah's greatest gift to him, not the years they had shared, precious though they were, but the understanding that love's true measure lies not in its duration, but in its depth. Not in its permanence, but in its transformative power to make those who experience it more generous, more grateful, and more fully alive to the endless possibilities that each new dawn brings to those brave enough to meet it with open hearts.